Carol, a well-dressed, attractive woman in her mid-40s, seemed really nervous as she entered my office. She fidgeted with her designer purse as she sat down. She briefly met my eyes, then quickly looked down at her shoes. In a trembling voice, she said, "I've never seen a therapist before, but my 17-year-old daughter just killed herself and I just don't know what to do." I suggested that she could start by telling me what happened. In a rapid, pressured way, with eyes still downcast, she started. "I could tell that she was moody, but the church counselor met with her and told me that she was just a normal teenager. How could this have happened? What did I miss?" Like so many other survivors after a suicide, Carol was racked with guilt and was on an excruciating quest in search of why. She described reading book after book on depression and suicide, and poring over her daughter's diary and writings for clues as to her state of mind, how she could have made such a desperate act, and most important, what she could have, should have done to prevent it. She finally looked up at me with a flat, almost empty expression. "None of this can bring my daughter back," she said. "So what do I do now?" I knew this question well. You see, my brother Jeff, who is a successful lawyer, took his life in April of 1995, just as I was finishing my doctorate in clinical psychology. We had grown much closer over the years, and despite my pleas for him to seek therapy for flashbacks related to childhood abuse, he insisted that he was, quote, on top of it. In his final note to me, he said, "I know you'll understand." Well, I did, and I didn't. And I was consumed with many of the same questions, the unanswerable questions that Carol had shared. Although I was devastated and fragmented, I had previously agreed to start a postdoctoral fellowship at a community mental health center right after graduation. So I moved to this health center, and upon starting, not only did I notice substantial changes in the ways in which I viewed myself as a clinician, I also became aware of changes in my behavior with clients, particularly those clients who were themselves suicidal or reacting to loss. To put it bluntly, I was a mess. I'd lost both confidence and competence. From the very beginning, I was plagued with the dread of losing a client to suicide. I wondered how in the world could I help anyone in distress when I couldn't save my own brother. I was also ambivalent about disclosing these feelings, or for that matter, my brother's loss, to the clinic staff, given the surprisingly negative reactions of my colleagues after the loss in grad school. I now know that the stigmatizing and pathologizing reactions of others are pretty common for survivors of suicide loss, but at the time it just solidified my shame around the loss and my resolve to keep it hidden. My clinical reactions that year seemed to vacillate between extremes. First, I became hypervigilant whenever suicide was even a remote possibility, complete with terrified impulses to hospitalize at even the slightest hint of a risk factor. Or else I'd find myself drawn into my clients' distress, sometimes to the point of sharing their belief that suicide was in fact the only solution to their unbearable pain. I became paralyzed, helpless, and utterly unable to access any hopeful feelings towards my clients. Instead, I compensated by uttering stupid platitudes like, let's pay attention to the safety plan again. I mean, it was ridiculous. But I soothed myself by imagining that at least my brother was no longer in the type of pain that my client was. While I over-identified with suicidal clients, I had a radically different reaction to clients who had loss issues. I completely lost my ability to feel, to empathize. It was like a blank screen had gone down between me and the client. While I faked my way through with over-intellectualized technique, but basically I was a clinical zombie. It was clear that I had lost both skill and perspective, and even though I could see how Jeff's loss was impacting my work, it felt like this awareness wasn't enough to fight the gravitational pull of either joining my dead brother through the suicidal despair of my clients or of fleeing the loss entirely. I knew I needed help. And after some research, I discovered that there were actually support groups specifically designed for those who had experienced a suicide loss. And to make a very long story very short, I will say that ultimately the support and validation provided by these groups played a huge role in my own healing. They even helped me regain some hope that I could again be a decent therapist. Well, as long as it didn't involve suicide. But local suicide prevention professionals had grand plans for me. They were excited to find a psychologist who was familiar with survivor losses and immediately wanted me to run survivor loss groups and to send me referrals. No, I said, I'm not ready. It became a kind of running joke that at each yearly conference they'd say, "Are you ready yet?" And I'd say, "Try me again next year." The next year they'd ask again, and I'm like, "One more year, give me another year." But after several years, I felt somehow ready and decided to accept referrals for suicide survivors. So back to Carol, who was my first referral. I quickly realized that my, quote, readiness could still include profound ambivalence. Even before my first meeting with her, I was overwhelmed by questions, doubts, and potential conflicts. As a parent myself, the loss of a child to suicide just seems unimaginably painful. And although I already felt compassion towards my future client, I was still unclear whether or not I could make empathic space for her pain without running from it. I also wondered if I'd be looking for culpability in Carol's parenting history, whether arising from my own theoretical biases or perhaps a tendency to project the blame I hold for my own mother's abusive parenting onto my client. And what if I found Carol to be culpable in her daughter's death? Would I then be able to sustain an empathic stance? So before I started, I made a promise to myself that I would do my best to separate my own issues from her experience and focus solely on her. So back to Carolyn. As our sessions continued, I found that I liked and cared about Carol and admired, even envied her as she proactively digested book after book and easily disclosed her loss to others. But while she passionately threw herself into the bereavement process, there was a way that something didn't fit. In the way that she related to me, there was a kind of distance or a flatness in her responses, a matter-of-fact way of relating that seemed lacking in emotional flavor. For instance, one day she described how she ran into one of her daughter's classmates and how this reminded her that she'd never get to see her daughter graduate from high school. This nearly brought me to tears, but when I asked Carol, "How did this feel for you?" she said, "It is what it is." I began to assume that this was just her interpersonal style, and found myself wondering if this related to her daughter's journal entries about, quote, "no one being able to feel my pain." Maybe Carol was simply unable to connect to her daughter's deeper emotional needs in this particular way. Well, a couple of months later, Carol opened the session with a bombshell, for me at least. She told me that she was planning to attend the local Suicide Prevention Center's Healing Day, which included a program for survivors and a ceremony to publicly honor their lost loved ones. Oh, bloody hell. I just RSVP'd for this. and I was planning to attend with my daughter. I was really looking forward to this, as it was one of the rare occasions when I could safely let myself be a vulnerable survivor and not a shrink. And now Carol would be there. Oh, bloody hell. So I smiled, nodded, and panicked. Being a good obsessive, the questions began. Should I attend? Well, I really wanted to, but this would mean that I'd first have to tell Carol that I was also a survivor. Yet most of my training, and granted this was the first year out of my training, most of my training had framed a therapist's intentional disclosure of personal details as a boundary violation, a lapse in therapeutic judgment, and rarely beneficial to clients. So when I went on to consider the potential dire consequences of this disclosure, how would it harm the treatment relationship? What about seeing me with my daughter? Would it be too painful for her, induce envy? She already felt distant. Would she detach even more? I then wondered how I would feel. Would I feel too exposed? Would I feel the need to hide my vulnerability at the event? Would I then resent her? I ruminated on, never considering that my self-disclosure could have a positive effect for either of us. But I knew I had to tell her, so in the next session I started. Carol, there's something I need to tell you. I didn't say it earlier because I was trying to protect both of us from discomfort, but now I wish I'd told you sooner. I lost my brother to suicide several years ago, and I'm also planning to attend the healing ceremony. I know it might be awkward for both of us to be attending that, but I'd like to talk about it ahead of time, and I also want to know how it feels to know that I'm also a survivor. Well, much to my surprise, Carol's whole demeanor shifted. She broadly smiled, laughed, and exclaimed, "Oh my God, you're a real person, not just a shrink sitting in a chair." Well, from that moment on, she felt alive and engaged with me like never before. Her speech became rich and vibrant. Our relationship deepened, along with her newly complex and expansive emotions. She told me that she now felt like I could truly understand her, instead of just, quote, reading about survivors in a book. And after the ceremony, she told me, "When I saw you with your daughter, I could see how much you love her, and I know you can understand that losing her would feel like your heart just gets ripped right out of your chest." And when she cried for the first time in our sessions, and I teared up too, she said, "It feels good to see you cry. It makes me feel less alone." She said that knowing that I survived the loss of my brother gave her faith that her loss could also be survivable. Well, following my disclosure, not only did Carol feel more present to me, but I felt more present to myself, as this seemed to sort of unlock the parts of me that had been hidden away in secret shame. I realized that what I had initially seen as Carol's distant relational style was in fact her reaction to my defensive need to hide my vulnerability from the treatment so it couldn't be known or felt by either of us. Was Carol finally able to make use of me in this new way because I finally had something useful to offer? So I wonder, as mental health professionals, what are we modeling if we allow our own vulnerabilities to hide in shame? Don't we owe it to our clients and ourselves to at least consider how revealing these could enhance the treatment? For my work with Carol, it made all the difference in the world. Once I stopped hiding my pain, she could begin to relate to another person who could truly share hers. Jeff had left me with one cryptic message: "I know you'll understand." What I've come to understand from this is that embracing and making use of all of the parts of ourselves, even the parts we'd like to hide from, can bring forth unexpected gifts, both in therapy and in life. Thank you.